So we're very happy to have Ryan Du from Wharton here to tell us about adaptive preference measurements using unstructured data. Just a quick reminder, if you're in the panel, so please feel free to unmute and ask questions. And then if you're in the audience, please feel free to use the Q&A function and we'll redirect your question to Ryan. Ryan, can you share your screen and the floor is yours.
Perfect. Great. Yeah. Well, thank you so much again for having me, and thanks everyone in the audience for being here. So like Yufeng said, my name is Ryan Du. I'm an assistant professor at Wharton, and today I'm going to talk actually about two papers, hence the kind of funky subtitle going on here. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about kind of two papers that really build on each other. So the first sort of paper in this set is this one called Adaptive Preference Measurement with Unstructured Data. This paper is already published in Management Science this past year. But the reason I want to talk about it, even though it may be sort of abnormal to talk about kind of an already published paper, is it really sets the groundwork and the framework for what I'm going to be doing in the second project, which is the one on the right here, Optimal Product Design Synthesis Pairing Generative Models with Adaptive Preference Measurement. This is a joint project with Wei Xin He, who's a PhD student here at Wharton and is in the audience, at least I think. But sort of these two projects, like I said, the second part really depends kind of on the first part. And so it's going to be useful for us to kind of go through the first part a little bit before jumping into kind of the newer stuff, which is where I hope to spend a lot of the time today. So these are very related projects, and both of them seek to really answer kind of one fundamental question, which is, how can we efficiently elicit consumers' preferences over unstructured data? So when I'm saying sort of elicit consumers' preferences, what I'm really talking about here is I want to be able to sort of quantify at an individual customer level what kinds of products people like. Don't have to be products, I guess, but I'm going to be thinking largely in terms of products. What kinds of products this person likes, what kind of products this person doesn't like. And when I'm talking about unstructured data here, I'm going to be mostly focusing on kind of image data. So basically using image data, how can we think about quantifying which types of products people like? Now, of course, sort of the idea of preference measurement is one that has a long history in marketing. So I'm sure this audience needs no sort of reminders or reintroductions to conjoint analysis, this idea of designing discrete choice experiments to kind of elicit people's preferences over products. And in conjoint analysis, like kind of the example conjoint task on the screen right now, usually sort of or I shouldn't say usually, the way that the products are expressed are in terms of a bunch of kind of finite attributes and sort of levels of those attributes. So think we have a phone, the phone has a brand, it has a size, it has a color, it has a price. And so we design a survey that we give to a bunch of people with, again, the goal of quantifying each individual person's preferences over this type of product. So of course, when we're sort of designing these surveys, being efficient in that process, and when I say efficient, I mean both sort of just from the kind of sort of intuitive sense of the word efficient, but I also mean statistically efficient. Being efficient is hugely important because we don't want to have somebody just sort of sitting there answering hundreds of questions. We really sort of, to get reliable data, we need to basically be able to sort of get information about preferences with just a few questions. And so in the sort of spirit of being efficient, there's been a long sort of, again, history of work on what are called adaptive methods. In adaptive methods, the idea is that we're going to sort of design the survey that we're giving to these people as we go along. So the basic idea is sort of the choice that we give you now, or the question we ask you now, depends on all the questions we've asked you before and your responses to that, with the idea of trying to ask the most sort of, again, information-rich question, the thing that's going to tell us the most about your preferences with each and every question that we ask. And so this is sort of a well-established thing. It is also a sort of paradigm with some limitations. Chiefly, those limitations are really the shortcomings. Maybe I should have actually called this a shortcoming, is exactly that sort of assumption that a product can be expressed in terms of sort of finite, discrete attributes and levels. I think in many cases, that is something that makes sense. Think about, again, the phone example here. But in many other contexts where we really care about learning and understanding people's preferences, it might make a little bit less sense. So for instance, if we think about measuring people's preferences over clothes, so thinking about kind of which dresses somebody might like, this is fundamentally kind of this aesthetic decision where, yeah, we could maybe come up with some attributes like it's a floral pattern, it's short versus long, it has this particular neckline. But in reality, when a consumer is evaluating these products, they're probably not thinking about those attributes, or at least they're thinking about them, but they're also thinking about sort of the design as a whole. How much does this sort of aesthetically appeal to me? So that's true for sort of clothes. It's true for other products where, for instance, shoes here. Again, I guess these are very related, but the sort of distinction that I want to draw between the dresses and the shoes also comes back to sort of a distinction that I'm going to make in just a second, which is we may not only care about figuring out kind of which kinds of products people like, we may care about figuring out even for a really specific product, like say an athletic shoe like this, we may care about sort of the stylings on that product. And when we're thinking about something like styling, again, this is a fundamentally sort of aesthetic kind of question, which may be difficult to quantify in terms of attributes and levels. Now, I'm going to focus on images in this talk, but this idea of thinking about measuring preferences over unstructured data, of course, extends more broadly. For instance, if you think about designing a movie trailer, the task of designing a movie trailer would involve sort of figuring out what kinds of content appeals to an audience in terms of sort of video data. And you can imagine this extending to sort of textual settings and multimodal settings as well. And so at sort of the core of both of these projects that I'm going to be talking about is this question, given sort of fundamentally that I don't want to make this assumption that a product can be expressed in terms of finite, discrete attributes and levels. What can I do? How can I use just these raw images, in this case, or sort of raw unstructured data more generally, to try to quantify individual consumer preferences? I also should have said, by the way, at the start of the talk, I am going to leave some kind of pauses sort of throughout the talk to sort of see if there are any questions that have come up. And now might be a good time to do that. So we kind of have the sort of setup of what I'm going to do. Before I tell you how I'm going to do it, any questions so far?
So as a reminder to audience who just joined, if you have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A session, and I'll redirect your question to Ryan. I do have a quick question on the adaptiveness of the conjoint design, even in just a finite dimensional sort of traditional data structure. So in textbook market research, we sort of learned that we should orthogonize the characteristic space in designing the questions to increase efficiency. So where's the adaptiveness of question design came in?
Right. So there's many ways that we can get at efficiency. One would be coming up with a sort of fixed design a priori that sort of is going to kind of do a good job across the board. I think that's what you're getting at. The sort of adaptive part, I guess, might be seen as an alternative to that, or at least complementary to that, where we sort of might sort of say for each individual person, as that person is sort of taking the survey, we might sort of tweak that initial design to come up with more informative questions about their sort of preferences. So I wouldn't view them as sort of I wouldn't view them as certain, in some sense, they're alternatives. Like if you look back kind of at the literature, there have been specific methods that are sort of adaptive versus just this idea of setting up a good experiment to begin with, but they're both achieving the same goal, which is just kind of getting the most information from respondents in as few questions as possible.
Thank you. And there's a quick question from the audience. Should I think of this paper or this talk as adding high dimensional or unstructured data to sort of a standard adaptive conjoint design?
Kind of, yeah. Although there's going to be some very specific kind of differences from conjoint too. So I might just change the word from conjoint to preference measurement, and then sort of we've got it, which is really actually kind of the title of the talk, adaptive preference measurement with unstructured data.
Thank you.
I have a quick question.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, how are you thinking about the fact that unstructured data contains both like the product design choices or product attributes and the presentation of products?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's going to be kind of two ways that I'm going to answer this because I've got these kind of two parts of the talk. So in the latter part of the talk, which is the one that I want to spend most of the time on today, we're going to have a very specific way of sort of getting rid of kind of the context of the display. That is, we're going to assume the product is always displayed in exactly the same way. And we're going to kind of get rid of the background and all of these sorts of things. So we'll get to that kind of later. But as a general rule, and kind of especially also in this first project, like if you think about these sort of dress images in the top right here, of course, somebody's preferences when I show them these images are going to be kind of conflated with the model, the background, how they're posing, these sorts of things. And I'm not going to directly deal with that, to be honest. So that's going to be kind of just part of what we're sort of measuring as sort of their preference for this image. In some sense, maybe that's a problem. In some sense, that's also how people actually make product decisions online. So when you go to kind of, for instance, these dresses are from this company Nuuly, which is a sub-brand of Urban Outfitters, which is the company I collaborated with on the first project here. When you go to their website or you go to kind of add products to your cart or basket, there's going to be a model there. And so in the first part, I'm going to just kind of take that as sort of part of what people are expressing preferences over. In the second part, we're going to kind of have an explicit way of dealing with that.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so let me then sort of beyond kind of the setup here, let me talk about, especially sort of with that nice transition, let me talk about what we actually do. So I'm going to be thinking about this kind of issue of preference measurement across two different problems that kind of mirror, or not kind of, that exactly mirror the sort of two papers that I'm kind of presenting jointly. The first kind of problem is what I'm calling the discriminative problem, which is a kind of hard word to say, I guess. The second is the generative problem. So in the discriminative problem, what I'm really thinking about is I'm thinking about kind of given a collection of images using, which might be a very massive collection of images, but images all of a sort of specific type of product, efficiently figuring out basically which images to show people at what point in time to think about kind of their preferences over that whole kind of set. This is a problem that's really been motivated by a very specific context, although I think it can be applied more broadly. That specific context is in the context of what are called subscription box businesses. So think, for instance, Wink, this is a wine subscription, or Stitch Fix, which is a clothing subscription. In both of these sort of situations, what you have is you have this massive catalog of products, and the company needs to figure out sort of a box of these products to sort of mail to you each month, sort of with your subscription. Now, a big thing that these companies care about is managing churn, making sure people are happy with their subscriptions. And so a big part of that is making sure that they're happy even with that very first box of either wine or clothes or whatever that they get. To that end, they've designed these things which are called onboarding surveys. So for instance, at Wink, they have these questions about like, how do you like your coffee? And at Stitch Fix, they have these kind of quite generic question of just asking which kinds of outfits would you wear? These surveys are given at the very start when you sort of sign up for the service, and they're used to kind of seed the recommendation system, basically as a kind of solution to this kind of cold start problem, which allows them to then figure out kind of what things they should be sending you or recommending to you. But if you think fundamentally, what are these onboarding surveys doing? They are measuring people's preferences in an efficient way. Hence, sort of, they fit very nicely into kind of the context that I'm thinking about here. How can we use, especially say in that Stitch Fix example, how can we use images to efficiently measure people's preferences? On the right-hand side, the sort of second paper, the second kind of problem that I'm going to be thinking about is what I'm calling the generative problem. And in this case, I'm thinking about cases where we don't really have this catalog of images available to us. Think, for instance, we're trying to design a new shoe. We think we want to kind of introduce a shoe with sort of maybe this kind of design, this sort of athletic shoe, but we're really thinking about just like, how should we style this shoe to kind of align with our customers' preferences and also to kind of fit whatever sort of needs that we might have in the market. Now, we may have some shoes available kind of as a sort of basis for doing this, but when we're really thinking about designing a new product, we're really thinking about kind of coming up with concepts that do not already exist. And so in the sort of second part of this talk, I'm going to try to get into this kind of question or problem of thinking about how can we pair sort of generative AI methods with this preference measurement sort of structure to on the fly generate images of sort of products that have never before existed to help in kind of the design process, all again within this sort of individual level customer sort of feedback survey setting here. Now, although these problems are sort of different, one assumes that we have a bunch of images already, the other is saying we're going to generate the most meaningful image on the fly. The way that we're going to do this follows sort of the same general outline, and I'll kind of go through that outline now. The first step in both cases is going to involve some form of sort of representation learning. That is, we need some way of mathematically working with these products. That is going to involve, in some sense, in both cases, taking sort of images or products and embedding them in some kind of latent space. And then we're going to pair that representation learning with this idea of Bayesian optimization. That is sort of what Bayesian optimization fundamentally involves two ingredients. The first is coming up with a sort of non-parametric model of somebody's preferences that kind of say, just like, if this was sort of the product embedding, here's how this person would feel about that product. But the sort of Bayesian optimization lens to this also allows us to kind of do this sort of efficient adaptive survey design. Specifically, Bayesian optimization gives us a way of using that non-parametric utility function to suggest sort of items that we should show people to sort of learn the most about their preferences. And so when we combine these two ingredients, what we get is we get a preference measurement system where we kind of have two sort of main benefits. The first is we're able to sort of quantify with kind of minimal assumptions somebody's preferences over these kinds of unstructured data as given in the representation learning part, which we can then use, and by the way, that works without pre-specifying any attributes at all about these sorts of products. And we can then use this to do all sorts of things like design those efficient onboarding surveys, conduct market research in the kind of standard conjoint lens, and sort of evaluate sort of new product concepts, especially in the second part where we're generating these designs on the fly. Okay, so kind of the plan for then the rest of the talk is I'm going to kind of go through these two sort of problems, and I'm going to talk more in detail about that sort of framework. I'm going to start by talking about sort of the discriminative problem, but the sort of methods are going to kind of be similar across the two with some important differences, which I'll sort of discuss once we get to kind of the generative problem. It's not going to be the sort of thing where it's kind of the same method applied in two different ways, but the sort of groundwork of the sort of framework is going to stay the same. Okay. Let me pause one more time to see if there's any other questions before I dive into the discriminative problem.
Ryan, question about the representation learning step. So I'm wondering, so you've decided to go with converting the image to the embedding or the numeric representation, but why not convert it or codify the image into some more interpretable structured representation, like you showed us earlier, I don't know, brand and these kind of things. So it makes it a bit harder to do that, but then doesn't that eventually it's going to be more interpretable and it's going to be easier to search in that space?
So at the end of the day, it comes back to kind of the sort of the motivation here, which is that in many of these contexts, we don't necessarily think a priori that we can even come up with a sort of meaningful, sort of low number of kind of features that might make sense to describe products in this space. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to come up with a kind of more information dense way of representing them through these embeddings. But what we can do is post talk. I'm not going to get into this that much in the talk, though it is there in the paper. If we really care about kind of coming back and interpreting these things, these preferences that we've learned over these sort of embeddings, we can do so by taking kind of some attributes that we may sort of have or that we've labeled, ex post, and sort of trying to map those back onto the utility. I view it as sort of a situation where sort of we're going to start with kind of the unstructured thing, and we're going to kind of approach it in the most sort of information sort of dense from a statistical perspective way of dealing with it, which I view as sort of these embeddings. Also maybe the most appropriate given the setting where we're not really sure what attributes are going to be meaningful for consumers. And then if we really care about exploring this, we can kind of do it later.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure.
So there are
Hey,
two
Ryan.
questions. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Quick question on the context. So in terms of the conjoint, can I have utility functions over a bunch of structured attributes along with these unstructured data? And if utility have these two components, and if the unstructured data use some more kind of non-parametric things, is that going to impact whatever I learn on my structured attributes?
Hypothetically, you could do that, though I haven't really explored it. So for instance, one important attribute that I'm going to kind of brush off would be price. So in these subscription box businesses, of course, price doesn't matter because you pay a fixed fee every month and then you get some products. But if you were going to extend something like this outside of the context of sort of subscription businesses, of course, you'd care about including price. And it's pretty sort of trivial, at least on paper, to kind of include price. Price would just be another dimension of this nonparametric utility function. You could treat it just like you're treating these sort of embeddings. But I don't have any sort of results to show you to kind of speak to that process. Any other questions?
So there are 3 questions in the audience. I think they're pretty related to Zhenling's question. You know, do you need to know features a priori, or would you to what extent you rely on the embedding model versus your prior knowledge of the feature? Are you using pre-trained embedding? And also, you know, the last question is basically the same question, I think.
Yeah, so, well, it's a sort of good moment to kind of transition to like, what do I actually do and how do we do this? But I'll answer it very quickly because I don't really plan to talk about the embeddings all that much. So we are going to use basically pre-trained embeddings or embeddings that have already been learned from, say, for instance, a recommendation system or something in the first part of the kind of talk. In the second part of the talk, this whole idea of embeddings is going to shift a little bit, and we'll get there when we get there. So let me jump then into the sort of the discriminative kind of aspect here. Remember, again, the idea is we have a ton of images of a specific product type. We want to, for a given person, figure out what kinds of that product the person likes or doesn't like. I'm going to be thinking about doing this in the context of clothes, where aesthetics would kind of play a big role. So the general sort of setup is we're trying to design a survey where, for instance, a customer comes, say a customer or it's a person in our market research or whatever. We want to figure out kind of the optimal sequence of questions to ask them to learn their preferences. I'm going to assume that those questions take the form of them rating a particular item. Like in this case, we show them this dress and they say how much they like it. I'll say, again, right off the bat, that the ratings are the easiest way to explain this, but it easily generalizes to choices and different kinds of comparisons too. So the person comes, and we're going to have them sort of rate a bunch of items. Of course, right off the bat, we have no information about them, so we'll show them an item at random, or maybe we've pre-selected kind of the best starting item in some way. Based on the rating that they give us, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of start or initialize or update this model of their preferences. With this model of preferences, what we're then going to do is we're going to sort of look at that model, and we're going to ask the kind of all-important question, which is, based on the information that we already have about this person, which next item would most improve our understanding of their preferences via that model? Once we have an answer to that question, we're of course going to then show them that item, the item that would most improve our understanding. They'll give us a rating, and then we'll kind of repeat this sort of system a bunch of times. Each new rating is used to update the model of preferences. And based on that model of preferences, we'll be able to ask again this question, which next item would most improve our understanding? And so on and so on and so on. To actually implement this, of course, we need 3 ingredients. The first thing is we need to sort of figure out how would we work with these images as inputs, which we've kind of already talked about in the chat. The second thing we need is how do we even model users' preferences over images at all? And the third thing that we need is how do we use a model to answer this kind of all-important sort of which next item question? So I've already said kind of the way that we're going to approach step 1 is we're basically, those weren't supposed to vanish. Okay, there we go. We're going to use embeddings. So specifically, we're going to kind of take this kind of content and we're going to embed them into a latent space in some way. I've already mentioned that I don't want to spend a ton of time doing this because we're not doing anything particularly new or creative here. We're either going to be using pre-trained models to do this, or we're going to be leveraging a recommendation system that the company already has, if there's a company that already has a recommendation system, and we're going to extract the embeddings from that. I think the more interesting parts are steps 2 and 3. So assuming we have then these embeddings, these is sort of representing every product as a sort of dense vector, how do we then model users' preferences over those sort of dense vectors? And so for now, let me just assume that I did this process, the survey process already. I got people to rate, I got a person, I, to rate a bunch of items, J, over sort of T questions. I have the ratings of those, and I have these sort of representations of these embeddings. So the ratings I'm going to call Y, the embeddings I'm going to call Z. Again, just assume for now that we already have this data. We'll talk about how to get this data on the next slide. So the question is, how do we relate Z to Y? A priori, we really should have no idea how these two things should be related, right? So for instance, there's no reason to assume that they should be linearly related, right? I mean, kind of case in point, we could change the embedding model we use for Z. We can just sub in whatever embedding model we want for Z, and the relationship between Z and Y would change, and we have no reason, again, a priori, to believe that there should be a linear relationship between those two things. And so what we're going to do is we're going to kind of take a step back and we're going to say, I don't want to make any assumptions. Instead, we're going to kind of model this using this simple kind of Bayesian nonparametric model, which assumes that the ratings, these YIT, are drawn from kind of some noisy process centered at a utility function. That's this UI thing, which is a function of the embeddings. And we're going to model that function using this kind of non-parametric prior over functions, which is called a Gaussian process. Now, if you've seen me present things before, you've probably heard of this idea, but just kind of as sort of a reminder or a brief overview, the way a Gaussian process, or what a Gaussian process does, is it provides a sort of prior distribution in the Bayesian sense over an unknown function. It's captured by basically two things. The first is a mean, which we're going to set to be 0, basically saying that we don't really know what to expect for this function. And sort of most of the structure is going to come from this thing called the covariance function, or the kernel. The kernel captures the different properties of these functions that we're modeling. So for instance, the kernel will say, is it a smooth function, like illustrated in the blue kind of line here, or is it a jagged function like the green line here, or anything kind of in between? Those parameters that govern the kernel can also be given their own priors. And so this really kind of gives us just this very flexible Bayesian way of modeling kind of this unknown utility function associated with these sort of noisy kind of ratings that people are giving us. Now, I want to kind of emphasize sort of two benefits of sort of this sort of, maybe three. I mean, the first is, of course, we don't need to take a stance on how these two things are related. But there's kind of two other benefits for doing kind of this model of people's preferences. The first is kind of that we can actually compute the posterior of that kind of utility function in closed form for that very, very simple model there. And the second is kind of this Bayesian angle gives us good finite sample sort of uncertainty quantification. And that uncertainty quantification is going to be really, really important for step 3 of this process. That is answering in kind of a mathematical way that question of which item do I show next. The closed form part, by the way, is important because we actually have to implement this on a survey platform. If we have to kind of do sort of simulation-based methods to figure out what is the next question, it's never going to happen. So these two things together make this model extremely useful. So why does uncertainty quantification matter? Well, uncertainty quantification matters because it allows us, again, to answer that question, which next item should we show to get us the most information? In the kind of world of Bayesian optimization, which again, a lot of this is sort of drawn and inspired from, what we're talking about when we talk about that, so first, I guess visually here, we have sort of a one-dimensional utility function in the black solid line, 4 ratings points for this, hypothetical person here, and then sort of uncertainty given by the dashed line. From this, what we can compute is we can compute something that the Bayesian optimization literature calls the acquisition function, which is going to be some function of the uncertainty around our utility function. In this case, in the kind of one that I've plotted at the bottom, what I'm plotting is sort of just the total uncertainty around that function. So you can see, for instance, that this acquisition function is sort of maximized at this point right here. And what this acquisition function tells us is it basically tells us, hey, if you want to kind of get the most informative next point, you should ask about an item that falls kind of right here at this, I guess, kind of 0.3 point. So the acquisition function is sort of this general thing that kind of guides what we should be doing next. And we can decide what that acquisition function is to kind of have our survey or have our questions work in a specific way. So in the illustration here, I've picked kind of the point where sort of uncertainty is the greatest. And so if I ask the next question corresponding to an item at that point, this is going to reduce the uncertainty kind of by a lot. But we can also imagine other ways that we might do this. For instance, if we only care about learning kind of what items people like, and we don't care about what they don't like, then we might, for instance, try to maximize sort of the upper confidence bound of this thing, or something like that, to kind of get the most efficient exploration towards sort of high preference regions. In general, this decision of the acquisition function, what kind of way that we use the uncertainty around the utility function to determine what items to show next, is sort of taking a stance on what do we care about learning about people's preferences, or how do we want this efficient procedure to unfold. Okay, so kind of taking a step back, we have these embeddings. These embeddings are going into a nonparametric utility function. We're taking the simple Bayesian model and using that to kind of create this sort of acquisition function, which tells us basically which items we should be showing people next, based on, for instance, reducing our uncertainty about their preferences as fast as possible. This is the basic framework. It's going to need to be adapted kind of heavily when we get to the generative part in hopefully just a few minutes here. But for now, let me pause and make sure or see what questions have come up around sort of the basic framework, this pairing of embeddings and Bayesian optimization.
I have a question on the, sort of one-step look-ahead nature of the objective function here. So this is a question I've had for a long time on adaptive survey design. So we should generally think of the one-step look-ahead approach as, a simplification, but not exactly the same as the fully optimal, experimentation, right? Is it just impossible to implement a fully optimal or approximate that version?
Yeah, I don't want to say impossible. So there has been work on kind of doing this, but generally speaking, it becomes very sort of intractable very quickly as we think about more than just one step ahead. And remember, what's sort of fundamental to what I'm doing here, and I emphasize it a little bit, but just to kind of re-emphasize it. What I'm doing needs to be able to be implemented as part of a survey that's going to actually respond to people in real time. So if it takes us sort of 10 minutes to figure out what is the next question we should ask, of course, we're not going to get very good information. That 10 minutes is just a made-up number, but it's kind of to emphasize the point that as this sort of procedure gets more complex, we're going to run into sort of technical difficulties, not just in kind of deriving and doing the math and implementing it in a sort of theoretical sense, but in a very practical sense, having it actually work for sort of real-time preference elicitation. But also, your question is sort of I mean, it's a great one in some sense. It's a sort of active area of research in the Bayesian optimization world as well. I'm not gonna touch it in either of these projects here.
Ryan, question about the uncertainty that's being quantified here. So I guess there is one type of uncertainty which is in the model. It's because there's not enough data, or I guess that's one type, but there's not enough data, and that's what you're kind of solving here. There's another type of uncertainty which is coming from the model not being flexible enough. And then there's a third type of uncertainty that's just coming from the consumers themselves. So they don't actually know what they feel about a certain dimension.
Sure.
So does this capture, is this like the sum of all of that, or is it?
In some sense. So it's the sum of at least two of those. So I mean, the beauty of sort of the Bayesian lens on models in the world is that we could hypothetically capture all three of those things within the same model. The one that I'm not going to capture is sort of the one you said about the structure of the model. There are hyperparameters in the kernel that determine how smooth it is, which would lead to how flexible the model is. And we are going to kind of estimate those in a sort of data-driven way, but kind of doing a proper Bayesian treatment of those hyperparameters to allow the uncertainty in them to propagate to the uncertainty bounds around this utility function would again be kind of too computationally complex to allow this to kind of work in real time, at least based on these solutions that I have explored. And so we're going to kind of treat those as kind of just like point estimates. But then the sort of uncertainty in terms of sort of what the function is and in the noise around this are both going to be things that we're kind of working with explicitly, right? So this sort of posterior bounds here are capturing both. Any other questions?
So just to follow up, I'm trying to think of an extreme case where, let's say there's some dimension along which consumers cannot decide between two. Like, let's say, I don't know, red and green shoes.
Sure.
And if you keep sampling red and green shoes because you're uncertain about the consumer's rating, it's going to be useless because you're not going to fix that by just collecting more samples.
So the issue here is not about sort of indifference. This isn't necessarily what we care about. What we're mapping here is just how certain are we about, say, in the basic case, the rating that they would give for these sorts of things. And so we would see, oh, this person really likes red shoes, and we'd also learn that they really like green shoes. In the sort of pairwise comparisons case, we would learn sort of that the sort of utility difference between red and green shoes is 0. But we're not sort of, we're not right now, like there's not really this, the tension that you expressed about kind of figuring out like which one is the best or whatever is not inherently sort of what we're going after, at least at this stage.
Got it. Got it. Thank you.
Okay.
So there's a question from the audience. So comment and a question. So the comment is drawing an analogy to LLM evaluation against reference responses. And then the question is, you know, is there a way to reflect changes in preference changes depending on the context?
Sorry, I don't think, now it's telling me that my internet connection is unstable. So we can blame the Wharton school for that one. I didn't quite hear the middle part of the question though.
Right, so the question is, how do you reflect context in case preferences are changing depending on the context?
It's an interesting question. I'm not really thinking about that in this particular situation. I'm not sure exactly kind of what that would mean. So maybe, for instance, in the survey environment, sort of preferences are different than when I go out to the actual website or something like this. These kinds of things are possible. I'm not going to kind of be modeling that process in any way. It sounds like an interesting thing that somebody could hypothetically explore, though.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. So sort of this is kind of the basic framework here then. So what I'm going to do now is I want to sort of quickly kind of go, oh, sorry, there's one more thing. So the final thing is I said that I was sort of explaining it in terms of ratings because it's the easiest. But I'll just mention that this sort of general framework is compatible with many study types. So for instance, ratings, we could have people say, give 2 items, then say, which one do you like and by how much? Or we can just have people sort of pick which of the sort of 2 items that we want. And in all of these cases, we can kind of generalize the method that I just described to kind of work with survey questions like this. So I sort of, this is all kind of from that first paper, and I want to make sure I leave myself plenty of time to talk about sort of the second paper. And so which, you know, I'm already sort of going to be plowing ahead, but I had the foresight. I know I'm sort of verbose, and so what I want to do now is I don't want to spend tons of time talking about the sort of results of this sort of first type. So let me just kind of explain at a high level how we kind of validated that this framework worked. So we ran a bunch of studies. We used data from this company, Newly. I already mentioned they're a clothing company. You've seen a bunch of their sort of dresses here, and we focused specifically on the dress category. We ran a bunch of different surveys with people on Amazon Mechanical Turk implementing this adaptive preference procedure. We did all of these different kind of types of questions, but I'm going to focus on the sort of choice questions. And what I want to basically kind of say are sort of 2 things, and I'm going to go super quick through them. The first is that it works, okay? So I don't want to go through every sort of number on this slide or every sort of density plot in this sort of chart here. You can check out the paper if you want to see. The way that we have validated that this sort of preference measurement thing works is that we had people basically sort of do the adaptive preference thing over a kind of a bunch of questions. And then we asked them questions that were not used as part of the training to see, for instance, if we took a random pair of items, could the model figure out which of that random pair the person would like? On the left, I show sort of some summary statistics. That's in that first column there on accuracy. And on the right-hand side, I show the sort of distribution of individual level accuracies, comparing against 2 benchmarks. One is sort of a status quo model suggested by the company as to sort of how they would model preferences, very similar to kind of just a collaborative filtering type nearest neighbors approach. And the kind of one in purple is sort of this adaptive linear model that kind of comes from the literature. So in short, it works at identifying sort of people's preferences. We can do this, for instance, task of guessing which item the person would like in a random pair. The accuracy is like not incredible. I view this as sort of the fact that this is a hard question based just on showing somebody a bunch of images. Could you then pick how they would evaluate sort of any random pair of images? But we do, I mean, way better than chance and also way better than sort of extant methods. And for many people, we do a really, really good job at sort of predicting their preferences. The other thing that I'll mention just very quickly is that the reason that the model does a good job is largely due to adaptivity. So the kind of comparison between these curves here is at the bottom, we have a model that's not adaptive at all and that isn't modeling preferences using this Gaussian process. In the middle, we have sort of the same thing, but adding kind of the Gaussian process to it. So that gain is the gain from using kind of that model. And then finally, the gain from the green to the red, this is sort of the gain from adaptivity. I should have explained what the axes are on this plot, sorry. So the axes on this plot, on the x-axis, we're saying how many questions did we ask the person? And on the sort of y-axis, we have sort of the average accuracy across people. And so you see that all of them are kind of weakly increasing sort of as we ask more questions, but sort of the adaptive model learns kind of the fastest and kind of gets to that kind of high point faster than the others. A lot of that is, again, due to the adaptivity. In the paper, we also talk about kind of how to do interpretation here. There may be many questions here, but I don't want to spend sort of more time talking about the sort of first part, because I want to spend sort of at least 10 minutes talking about the kind of cool ways that we're generalizing this framework to use sort of the sort of generative or the generative part, to use generative AI methods. And so with that, I'm going to kind of switch gears, though not entirely, to think about kind of this related problem. So under kind of the discriminative approach, again, the idea was we had a fixed catalog of items available to us. Those were those kind of X's. So we were trying to model what somebody's preferences would be given an image where we could just select images from the set that we already have. That's why I called this kind of the discriminative approach. Under this new approach, as I already kind of outlined, what we're going to be doing instead is we're going to be assuming that we're, again, focusing on a specific class of products, like shoes. Say maybe even shoes that have a design that looks roughly like this. And then we're going to be trying to think about kind of how should we design these shoes? It's a new shoe, a shoe that never existed before. And what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to kind of learn, again, at an individual customer sort of level, kind of how this customer sort of views designs within this space, to really think about which hypothetical item in the class of shoes would a person prefer. And so again, it's individual level preference measurement. But we're not going to, again, assume that we have a fixed catalog of items available. Instead, we're going to kind of pair the framework that I just described with a generative model of images. So all of these images here are generated by sort of AI, and this is where we're going here, to kind of come up with then sort of the best hypothetical product design to kind of meet this person's need. I call this the generative model, maybe for obvious reasons, but fundamentally the switch is we're no longer kind of conditioning on X, but we're really thinking about sort of this joint distribution of ratings and new product concepts. That is, we're generating kind of X as part of the process rather than just drawing it from a cat. Okay, so let me just go through kind of the basics of the framework here too, and then I'll pause for questions. I realize that it's been a minute, but let me kind of get through this because I think this is the interesting part. So like I said a second ago, the basic framework and the way that we're thinking about doing this remains fundamentally the same from the sort of first part. There's going to be these 3 steps. The things that kind of change are how we approach these steps. And in particular, it's really going to be steps 1 and 3 that change a lot. So the first thing is we're now no longer going to be just kind of embedding images into kind of some space using a pre-trained model. Instead, we need a way of generating images. In particular, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be using this combination of sort of 2, and these are both going to be kind of off-the-shelf sort of tools that we adapt to our purposes. We're going to be combining this model called Stable Diffusion, which is kind of one of the kind of core, maybe we call it a foundation model, I guess, of sort of image generation these days. This is going to be kind of the bedrock of sort of how we're going to be generating these images. And to make sure that kind of the images that we generate fit the needs of the designer, meaning that they match kind of exactly the product class that we're kind of after, we're going to be combining this sort of stable diffusion idea with ControlNet, which is, again, I'll talk about it in a second, but a way of giving us very fine-grained control over the class of items that's generated in this model. And so instead of sort of thinking about embeddings here, what we're going to be thinking about is we're going to be thinking about points in the latent space of the Stable Diffusion model, which I'll talk about in just a second. The part of how we model users' preferences over images isn't going to change at all. And then in step 3, this is also going to change because we have this really, really, really big challenge now, which is that we've gone from using these kind of small, dense vectors, like the sort of ones that we were talking about with the pre-trained models before, to trying to optimize people's preferences over the absolutely massive high-dimensional latent space of a model like Stable Diffusion. And so to kind of solve that sort of problem of figuring out what item to show people next, we're going to have to adopt some ideas from high-dimensional Bayesian optimization. In particular, we're going to draw on this idea of random embeddings. There's a few other technical details that are going to kind of have to change. I don't want to sort of say that we're just going to be kind of taking off-the-shelf things and plugging them in. I'll get into all of the sort of nitty-gritty details of what has to change in the next couple minutes. But maybe now's a good time to kind of pause now that I've introduced the new framework and see if there are any questions, at least about what I'm setting out to do here.
I have a quick question. So would you abandon areas in the characteristic space where you have a low prior on the respondent's preference so that you can concentrate more questions in the area where you would likely find where the person prefers? It seems like if you're just minimizing uncertainty, you wouldn't necessarily do that. I'm wondering what's your intuition?
Yeah, I think that there are ways of, okay, so I think maybe there's 2 aspects to your question. So tell me if I'm getting at both of them. So I think first of all, there's ways to make the model or the framework as a whole more efficient. For instance, leveraging prior sort of responses to like that other people have sort of given in the past to think about a priori, where do we kind of expect people to sort of there to be items that they like or don't like or whatever. Hypothetically, we could sort of use sort of this knowledge to kind of do a more efficient or better job of kind of learning preferences in a more efficient way. Again, it's sort of this balance of being able to do this in real time. But I think there are many extensions there that could hypothetically be sort of valuable. In terms of what do we actually focus on? Is it just kind of the uncertainty in preferences, or is it figuring out what items people like? That's going to be kind of a conscious decision that we make at some point. In this project, we're going to be thinking about just modeling which items that people like. And so we are going to just kind of ignore those sort of areas where we find, okay, the person doesn't really like this particular item. I'm not sure that that answers your question, though. Is that what you were asking, or was it something else?
No, that generally makes sense. I guess I was mostly focusing on your uncertainty as a researcher on the customers or the company on the customer's preference. But it sounds like you're one approach could just be, stepwise minimizing or putting the next point to areas where you have the maximum amount of uncertainty, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So there are a couple of other questions in the audience, but I think for the interest of time, it probably would make sense for you to finish most of the talk and then let's get to those remaining questions.
Sure. So yeah, sounds good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of give you the very high level overview of kind of these components, and I'll show you a sort of a brief example of kind of how this stuff works. And so I've been allotted sort of 50 minutes with 10 minutes Q&A. Maybe we'll do 52 minutes and 8 minutes Q&A if no one objects. And I'm not going to give you time to object. So the generative model part, sort of the kind of 2 ingredients that we are working with here. Again, we're not doing anything particularly new. Stable diffusion, if you're unfamiliar with it, the way it works is it basically takes very high resolution images. It kind of embeds them in a certain way using kind of an image autoencoder of sorts. There's different ways that this works kind of in the literature. And then based on kind of the embeddings that are kind of learned through this image autoencoder, it takes the images and it sort of slowly adds noise to them until the point that sort of the image becomes a pure kind of Gaussian noise, so isotropic Gaussian. And then it kind of learns the process of converting that noise back to the image. What's really important here is that sort of in this stable diffusion model, this end point is distributed kind of Gaussian, and that to kind of do this sort of denoising process from the Gaussian noise to an image, you can also add conditioning information that kind of says to the model, what kind of image do you want to generate? This is how, for instance, if you go into ChatGPT and you say, generate me a picture of some shoes, this is essentially how it's working. It's starting with some noise, decoding it into an image, and using your prompt to kind of guide which image appears. These two ingredients, the Gaussian noise and the conditioning information, are going to be very, very important for us to kind of tell the model which kinds of images we want to generate. But this even is not specific enough. To kind of make the model more specific, we're also going to adapt this framework called ControlNet, which adds another way of sort of adding conditioning information into kind of the model. So we can condition not just on kind of a prompt like a pair of sneakers, but actually say, here's the outline of the shoes that we kind of want to generate. Generate us images that look kind of like that outline. And so when we have these two ingredients here, the outline, the prompt, and this sort of noise, we're then going to get a kind of workable latent space that we're going to be able to kind of optimize over. The way that we're going to do that optimization, though, is a little bit tricky. The Bayesian optimization that we talked about in the previous part really only works well in low-dimensional spaces. And so to kind of solve that, again, we're going from 10 or 20 dimensions in the previous paper to thousands of dimensions here. What we're going to need to do is we're going to need to adopt a sort of a new high-dimensional Bayesian optimization framework. In particular, we're going to take this idea of random embedding Bayesian optimization. I'm not going to go through all the sort of technical details again for the sake of time, but the basic idea, and it's kind of a wild idea. The basic idea is in many cases, the response, like people's preferences, doesn't really depend on all of the different latent dimensions of this kind of vector. And so what you can do is you can literally just randomly project the original space down to a lower dimensional latent space using just a random, say, a random projection matrix. And you can optimize in that sort of lower dimensional space and then project back up. And in many cases, this actually works pretty well. The challenge of getting it to work in our case is constraining this process to actually generate sort of meaningfully or good images, which is non-trivial at all. This is where sort of the work that we do comes in, and it's not worth spending time. I say not worth. I mean, this is literally where all the work of this project went in. But for the sake of time, it's not sort of worth spending a ton of time talking about basically how we guarantee sort of the random embedding Bayesian optimization kind of gives us sort of good images. There's a lot of kind of tricky math there. A special thanks to Wei-Shin, my doctoral student here at Wharton, who's done a lot of this cool stuff. Okay. So let me just show you like a few examples of kind of this working, and then I'll stop and we can ask some questions. So these are all results from simulations. The basic idea is we start with the kind of product concept we want. That's going to involve sort of saying something like a product edge. We're going to sort of have an area of the image that we really care about optimizing. In this case, you can see that right here with shoes. We're going to give it a prompt, which is kind of the class of things that we care about. And to actually run these simulations, what we're doing is we're basically kind of simulating somebody's preferences by kind of matching a textual phrase to an image. So in this case, we're assuming that this person only cares about blue shoes. And so we then run kind of this model. Again, this is all in simulation. And we sort of see that kind of relatively quickly in this sort of using this sort of high dimensional Bayesian optimization framework, the model learns that really this sort of synthetic respondent only likes kind of blue shoes. I won't go over the sort of plot here. This kind of can be extended in many cases. So in this case, we say that the sort of respondent, the simulated respondent, really likes sort of red shoes with geometric patterns. The model can learn kind of this idea, this sort of prototype too. And it doesn't just work with shoes. So here, for instance, we have a backpack. This person really cares about just a backpack that's made out of canvas. The model learns a backpack that's made out of canvas. And in this case, the model says or the person cares about a blue and orange backpack. Hey, the model learns a blue and orange backpack. Not enough time to kind of do justice kind of to this, but I hope that I've at least piqued your interest in kind of what we're doing here. There will be a sort of a working paper describing all of these things out soon. We're kind of in the process of tweaking our survey app to kind of use this stable diffusion thing and the sort of new high dimensional optimization process, which is a non-trivial undertaking. But hopefully we'll have some sort of results that are non-simulated on this kind of framework very soon. And so there's a lot of stuff going on. Of course, let me just kind of wrap it up by putting this summary slide up here and pausing and seeing what other questions kind of have come up. And also, of course, thanking the organizers and you guys for your attention and for having me here today.
Thank you very much, Ryan. I thought you were going to summarize, but this is
No,
great.
I was just going to leave it here so people can read it, and I made sure that there's a lot of bullet points so people have the sense that I really did a lot in these two projects.
Ryan,
Thanks for the great talk. Yeah.
Great talk, super interesting.
Go ahead.
Can you give us some intuitions of how does it solve these high dimensionality problems? When you're working with like thousands of embeddings, how are they gonna be able to learn these are the useful ones to pick up?
So it doesn't learn which are the useful ones. That's kind of the interesting sort of idea of this sort of random embedding, idea. So the assumption is that if the function that we care about, if this end utility function only really depends on some of the embeddings, then if we kind of take the massive space and we just imagine a random sort of linear projection that shoots through that kind of high dimensional space, if we sort of kind of optimize along that kind of random projection, most kind of the dimensions of the original space don't matter anyway. And so that random projection is going to be able to pick up kind of the sort of meaningful signal. We're not going to, again, be able to figure out which dimensions actually are sort of meaningful, but by kind of sort of making this assumption that most of them don't matter and then projecting randomly down, we're going to be able to kind of still do this optimization and be able to kind of map things back up at the end of the day to get the images that we care about. The hard part is actually not the sort of projecting down. That's kind of the easy part. The hard part is doing it in a way that makes it so that when we go back kind of to the original space, we still end up with sort of these Gaussian vectors in the Stable Diffusion model that can actually be kind of decoded into a good non-blurry image. And that's kind of where a lot of the work here has happened. I mean, as an aside, I find this result kind of mind-blowing too. This is not our result, the random embedding idea. It comes straight from that random embedding Bayesian optimization paper, which has this very catchy title, which is like, do Bayesian optimization in a billion dimensions or something like that. But if you're curious, that would be the sort of the reference there.
Hey, Ryan, I have a question that looks interesting. I'm wondering why random embeddings might be a better solution than, let's say, a principal component approach. Is it because the latent vectors are already orthogonal, so it makes it difficult? Or what do you know? Do you have an intuition of why that's the case?
I don't really have an intuition, although it's sort of at the end of the day, the kind of main thing is, I think, to apply something like, say, for instance, PCA or any of these things, what we'd have to do is we'd have to sort of start by generating a bunch of product concepts and then figure out kind of like a good like dimension mapping down. We actually tried this kind of in early stages of this project, not with PCA, but sort of with sort of something like a VAE or something like that, where we basically sort of said, okay, we care about shoes. We're going to generate a bunch of shoe concepts without any preference data. Then we're going to train a model that reduces the dimensionality of the latent sort of the latent Gaussian noise of all of those shoes, say PCA. Again, I don't know if we ever really tried PCA. Wei-Shin would probably know, but she's barred from responding, I guess. But we tried things like VAE and stuff like that. And we found that this, I mean, I don't know, we never got this to work very well. And so we kind of pivoted then to this sort of this random embedding idea. And it was really a combination of this random embedding idea with some of the sort of mathy insights that I skipped about, for instance, how do you constrain the random embeddings in a way that gives you sort of random noise vectors that sort of map into oh, here's Wei-Shin. She's been put on the spot looking terrified. Maybe she knows if we tried PCA at some point. I don't know. But anyway, the way that we have seems to work, and so we never really went back.
And the utility function is computed over random embeddings, right?
Yeah, so it's not the projection matrix stays fixed for a given person for all of the things. Otherwise, you wouldn't learn anything. But it's defined over sort of these lower dimensional random embeddings.
Do you feel you could learn by some methods like a projection while you get more data that makes the projection more meaningful and identify like?
So kind of like a two-part Bayesian optimization. So you're doing adaptive learning of the projection matrix while also doing adaptive learning of the preferences.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, but maybe. Yeah, I'd have to think about it. I don't know, interesting idea.
Yeah, thank you. Anyway, that looks super cool.
Thank you. Weixin,
So
anything
we're
to add?
exactly at 1 p.m. Let me just quickly say something. So I'm gonna stop recording, and then there's still a lot of interesting questions from the audience. So if we didn't get to your question, please feel free to raise your hand. We'll promote you to panelists, and we can just discuss. And I'll pause the recording.